When a son is born in a family in most Middle Eastern societies, circumcision is definitely in the to-do list for the child. But do you know the origin of this custom and how it came about? Nowadays, many think of it as hygienic, but was that the main reason for its inception? Or was this act supposed to have had a deeper meaning? Most people have a notion that it is a religious act and it has something to do with God. But do you know exactly why God wanted this done? How did that get started? Does this apply to you and me today? For answers to these questions, this program looks to the Bible where this custom was originated. And if you want to know what does this have to do with us in the 21st century, this program is also for you. The Bible tells us that Abraham, who lived some 4,000 years ago, received a call from God to move out of Ur of Chaldee, which is in today's Iraq. And God promised Abraham that he will make a great nation from Abraham. We can see that in Genesis chapter 12, in verses 2, 4, and 7. So Abraham, when he was 75 years old, left Ur of Chaldee with his wife Sarah. Now Sarah was 65 years of age, and at the time they did not have any kids. Meanwhile, God kept repeating his promise to Abraham. You can look into Genesis chapter 13, verses 14 through 16 for that. You can also see here as verses in Genesis chapter 15, verses 5 and 18 are shown. Anyhow, 10 more years went by, and Sarah and Abraham still didn't have any child. By then, Abraham is 85 and Sarah is 75. So Sarah's patience runs out and asks Abraham to go to her Egyptian maid Hagar. Now, getting back to our subject, note that at this time circumcision has not been instituted by God yet. So the uncircumcised Abraham goes to Hagar, and from that union Ishmael is born, when Abraham was 86. For Abraham and Sarah's disobedience, God waits another 13 years before he visited Abraham again. By the way, regarding this number 13, many people think 13 is a bad luck number. But in the Bible, 13 is a number that signifies disobedience. And of course, disobeying God certainly does bring unwanted consequences. So after 13 years, when Abraham is 99 and Ishmael is 13, God tells Abraham that he and Sarah will have their promised miracle child next year. But Abraham needed to get circumcised first. We read this in Genesis chapter 17, verse 10, where God tells Abraham, "This is my covenant with you and your descendants after you, the covenant you are to keep." What is this covenant? That every male among you shall be circumcised. And verse 11, "You are to undergo circumcision, and it will be the sign of the covenant between me and you." Verse 12, "For the generations to come, every male among you who is 8 days old must be circumcised." Abraham, of course, was flabbergasted that at age 100 God will give him a son when his wife Sarah is 90. So Abraham points to his firstborn Ishmael. And as we read in verse 18, "And Abraham said to God, if only Ishmael might live under your blessing," meaning that Abraham is asking God, won't you consider Ishmael as the promised child? God insists that the promised child is also the miracle child, the child that has to be born of the circumcised Abraham and his true wife Sarah. God wanted to make it crystal clear to Abraham that Isaac is the promised child. So in Genesis chapter 17, we read in verse 19, "Then God said, yes, but your wife Sarah will bear you a son, and you will call him Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him." And God, knowing that Abraham loved Ishmael, to put Abraham's mind at ease regarding Ishmael, God adds in verse 20, "And as for Ishmael, I have heard you. I will surely bless him. I will make him fruitful and will greatly increase his numbers. He will be the father of 12 rulers, and I will make him into a great nation." Now, nation meaning certain people, and in this case, God is talking about the Arabs. God, again, just to clarify and settle this issue in Abraham's mind, repeats in verse 21, "But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear you by this time next year." So back to our subject of circumcision, we read in verse 24, Abraham was 99 years old when he was circumcised. And we read in verse 25, "And his son Ishmael was 13. The Bible teaches us that behind every physical act God is asking us to do, God has a deeper spiritual meaning for that act, which helps us in our personal relationship with Him. In this case, circumcision, which is the cutting off of the flesh, was a symbolic act for Abraham and his descendants, that they should follow God rather than their flesh. So their hearts should turn from their desires of the flesh to the desires of the Holy God. Some 450 years later, we see that God lays out His law for Moses and Israelites who were the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God speaks of circumcision, and not circumcision of the flesh, but of the heart. We see this in Deuteronomy chapter 10. God says in verse 16, "Circumcise your hearts," that is your inner being, "therefore, and do not be stiff-necked any longer." In case we miss this, God repeats this in Deuteronomy 30, verse 6. "Jehovah your God will circumcise your hearts and the hearts of your descendants, so that you may love Him with all your heart and with all your soul and live." Notice God wants us to love Him both with our hearts as well as honoring Him with our bodies, which is about a close and pure relationship rather than performing a ritual or a physical act to satisfy a rule. God, through the prophet Jeremiah, even warns us not to be proud of performing any ritual act, but to be concerned about the quality of our heart-to-heart relationship with Him. We see this in Jeremiah chapter 9, in verse 24, "But let the one who boasts boast about this, that they have the understanding to know me." To know me means that we have a close and intimate relationship with God. That I am the Lord who exercises kindness, justice, and righteousness on earth. For in these I delight, declares the Lord. So, dear ones, anywhere that you see in the name of the Lord people in power are unkind, unrighteous, or unjust, know that they are not following Jehovah, God of the Bible. And this God even warns in verse 25, "The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will punish all who are circumcised only in the flesh." God is very clear. Being circumcised only in the flesh is totally inadequate in His sight. So He will punish them if that is all they are relying on. Since God is a spirit, what matters to Him is beyond the physical. He is after what is happening inside us. Verse 26 describes how God views outside condition of various people. God says, "Egypt, Judah, Edom, Ammon, Moab, and all who live in the wilderness in distant places. For all these nations are really uncircumcised, and even the whole house of Israel is uncircumcised in heart." Again, you see God's focus is our hearts, our inside, our internal condition.